The cold, sterile hum of the outpost was the first thing to greet me each morning. A constant, low thrum against the vast, indifferent silence of the void outside. My quarters, a windowless cube carved into the rock, offered no natural light, only the steady glow of utility panels. I rose from the narrow cot, the synthetic fabric cool against my skin, and ran a hand over the stubble on my jaw. Another cycle had turned. My routine was a meticulously crafted bulwark against the creeping isolation. A measured scoop of nutrient paste, a precisely timed exercise regimen in the small, repurposed cargo bay, then the walk to my xenobotanical lab. Each step down the echoing, metal-grated corridors was a deliberate act, a confirmation of my own existence in this distant, forgotten corner of reality. The air, recycled and filtered countless times, tasted faintly of ozone and old dust. I was coal, and this was my work, my purpose. For cycles, the work had been predictable, cataloging the sparse, hardy flora clinging to the surface, analyzing atmospheric composition, the slow, methodical grind of scientific discovery. Then, 3 shifts ago, the ground-penetrating radar had pinged. Not a geological anomaly, not a mineral deposit, something else entirely. The excavation site was a cavernous space, once a storage depot, now a gaping maw in the planet's crust. Heavy-duty lights cast stark shadows across its rough-hewn walls, illuminating the impossible thing we had uncovered. It wasn't built. It simply was. A structure of obsidian-like material, its facets catching and distorting the light in ways that defied Euclidean understanding. Angles met where they shouldn't, planes twisted into themselves, and the geometry, even to my trained eye, seemed to shift and writhe at the periphery of vision. It was ancient, unimaginably so, and its presence felt less like a discovery and more like an awakening. My current task involved samples of the strange phosphorescent lichen that grew in the immediate vicinity of the structure. Its tendrils pulsed with a faint internal light, reacting to the impossible energies that emanated from the black edifice. I sat at my console, the microscope's lens focused on a delicate filament, its cells arranged in patterns unlike anything I'd ever seen. My fingers flew across the holographic interface, logging data, charting growth rates, noting the subtle chromatic shifts. This was the pinnacle of my career, a scientific marvel, a mystery demanding unraveling. A flicker. It was subtle at first, easily dismissed. A momentary skip in the overhead lighting, perhaps, or a glitch in my vision from prolonged screen time. I rubbed my eyes, blinking away the faint afterimage. The lichen under the lens continued its slow, silent pulse. Then it happened again. Not a light flicker, but a spatial stutter. The far wall of the lab, normally a flat expanse of gray composite, seemed to ripple, as if seen through heat haze. But there was no heat, only the controlled climate of the outpost. The air, for a fraction of a second, thickened, grew heavy. And through that brief, impossible distortion, I saw it. A narrow, cobbled lane, slick with damp. The muted glow of distant, gas-lit lamps. The skeletal branches of bare trees reaching into a sky choked with a low, rolling mist. The vision snapped away as quickly as it had come. The lab wall was solid gray once more, the air thin and sterile. My breath hitched. I pushed back from the console, my chair scraping loudly against the metal floor, the sound harsh in the sudden quiet. My heart, a drum against my ribs, betrayed the tremor in my hands. What was that? I whispered into the empty room, the words swallowed by the oppressive silence. I stood, walking slowly towards the wall where the impossible image had manifested. My fingers pressed against the cool, unyielding surface. No seam, no projector, no hidden panel. It was just a wall. A normal, mundane wall in a very abnormal, distant outpost. I tried to rationalize it. Fatigue, stress, a micro-seizure perhaps. The mind, under extreme isolation, could play tricks. But the clarity of the image, the sudden visceral feel of the damp air, the impossible scent. It had been too real, too vivid to be a mere hallucination. It felt like a memory I'd never had, an experience grafted onto my mind. My gaze drifted to the open maw of the excavation site, visible through the reinforced viewport at the end of the corridor. The black, impossible angles of the subterranean structure seemed to shimmer, drawing the eye, holding it. Was it? Calling to me? Or merely asserting its presence? My scientific wonder, once a pure, bright flame, now flickered with a strange, nascent unease. I was Cole, and my world, once so clearly defined, had just bent. I rose from the narrow cot, the metallic tang of recycled air a familiar bite in my nostrils. Today, however, a subtle unease clung to me, a residue from the impossible geometry I had glimpsed beneath the surface. It was a feeling like a forgotten word on the tip of my tongue, a persistent whisper of wrongness. I moved through my morning ritual, a deliberate act of defiance against the strange pull I felt, calibrating my environmental sensors, checking the atmospheric scrubbers, reviewing the overnight geological scans, each task a bulwark against the encroaching strangeness. As I adjusted the nutrient paste dispenser, a flicker caught my peripheral vision. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. Fatigue, I told myself. The deep space survey mission, the isolation, the sheer scale of the unknown. It was all a strain. Later, in the observation chamber, the distortions sharpened. I was studying the panoramic data from the subsurface excavation, the rendered images of the non-Euclidean structure glowing faintly on the main display. Its angles defied logic. Its curves bent perception, even in 2 dimensions. As I zoomed in on a particularly complex junction of planes, the display screen itself seemed to waver. The pixels didn't just flicker. They bent, pulling the lines of the structure into impossible knots, then snapping back to their original, equally impossible configuration. A low, resonant hum, distinct from the outpost's steady thrum, vibrated through the floor plates, rising and falling with a cadence that felt almost organic. It wasn't in the acoustic readouts. It was in my bones. Just sensor ghosting, I muttered, my voice a dry rasp in the quiet chamber. I tapped the console, running diagnostics on the display unit, then on the structural integrity field. Everything read green, perfect. Yet the hum persisted, a deep thrumming that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere. It was a sound that tasted of damp earth and wood smoke, an illogical sensory crossover that sent a shiver down my spine. My focus returned to the structure's data, but the image on the screen was no longer static. Through the shimmering lines, I began to perceive something else, something utterly alien to the sterile rock of this exoplanet. The metallic walls of the observation chamber began to soften, their sharp edges blurring. A scent, faint but unmistakable, of peat and decay overlay the recycled air. Then, through the warped display, as if superimposed over the alien geometry, I saw it. Or felt it. The screen dissolved, and I found myself staring not at the rock face of the exoplanet, but through a mist-shrouded window. Beyond it, a narrow, winding lane, slick with damp, vanished into a pervasive, all-encompassing fog. Small, squat buildings, their roofs thatched with unseen material huddled together. It was a foggy village, utterly impossible, utterly present. My scientific training screamed hallucination, environmental stress, sensory overload. I slammed my palm against the console, the solid thud a desperate anchor to the reality I knew. But the hum, the deep, resonant thrum intensified, a low growl that vibrated through my teeth. I spun around, scanning the chamber. The utility panels along the wall seemed to breathe, their indicator lights pulsing with an irregular rhythm. My heart hammered, not from fear, but from a desperate, frantic need to understand. I was Cole, xenobotanist, dedicated to objective truth. This This was not objective. This was a violation of all known parameters. I forced myself to breathe, to rationalize. Perhaps a localized electromagnetic field from the structure was interfering with my neural pathways, creating false sensory input. A plausible, if unsettling, hypothesis. I pulled up my personal biometric data. Heart rate elevated, yes. Adrenaline surging. But no signs of fever, no chemical imbalances. Physically, I was sound. Yet the memory of the foggy village, so vivid, so utterly real in its brief intrusion, clung to the edges of my perception. And I, Cole, the man of science, was beginning to doubt the solidity of the ground beneath my feet. My eyes, usually sharp with the keen focus of a xenobotanist, seemed shadowed, haunted by the impossible angles I'd witnessed beneath the surface. Today, I would descend again. It was my only tether to the quantifiable, the logical, in a world that was rapidly shedding its skin of reason. The journey through the outpost's corridors felt longer than I remembered. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, but the sensation lingered, a subtle tremor in my peripheral vision. I dismissed it as fatigue, a byproduct of too many sleepless nights spent poring over uninterpretable data. Reaching the excavation shaft, I donned my environmental suit. The airlock hissed, cycling me into the raw, unconditioned atmosphere of the cavern. The air here was thin, carrying the metallic scent of pulverized rock and something else. Something indescribably ancient and vast. My boots crunched on the loose scree as I began my descent. The deeper I went, the more the air grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure. Then I was there, standing before the structure. It pulsed with a faint internal luminescence, a soft, unearthly glow that seemed to emanate from within the rock itself. Its surfaces were not flat nor curved, but something else entirely, a paradox of form that defied conventional optics. Where my mind expected a corner, my eyes saw a continuous plane. Where I anticipated a straight edge, a subtle, impossible twist defied the very concept of Euclidean space. I extended a gloved hand, the scanner held firmly. Its readouts flickered wildly, a cacophony of conflicting data points. Gravimetric anomalies, energy signatures beyond anything known, and spatial coordinates that shifted even as the sensor array locked onto them. This was the source of the distortion, the impossible geometry bleeding into my world. I pressed the scanner against a particularly unsettling surface, one that seemed to recede and advance simultaneously. A low hum resonated through my suit, vibrating against my bones. The cavern around me wavered. The rough-hewn rock walls of the shaft seemed to soften, their hard edges blurring. My vision swam, and for a terrifying instant, the cavern dissolved. I was standing not in a subterranean chamber, but on cobblestone. A dense, wet fog swirled around my knees, clinging to the ancient, damp stones. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and decay, a stark contrast to the sterile, recycled air of the outpost. Above me, obscured by the shifting gray veil, I sensed unseen gables and roofs. This was a place I knew, yet could not place. A name whispered at the edge of my awareness. A ghost of memory. A low, guttural sound like a distant moan echoed through the fog. My heart seized. I took a hesitant step forward, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots unnervingly real. This was no hallucination born of sleep deprivation. This was a full sensory immersion. I was in the foggy village. I turned, desperate to find the familiar rock face of the cavern, the reassuring hum of my equipment. But there was only the impenetrable shroud, the endless gray expanse. The air tasted of salt and something metallic, like old blood. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the illusion shattered. The fog dissipated, the cobblestones dissolved, and I was back in the cavern, leaning heavily against the impossible surface, my environmental suit covered in the fine dust of the exoplanet. The scanner, now alive, shrieked a warning, its internal diagnostics flashing red. My breath hitched, ragged and shallow. I stumbled backward, away from the structure, my gaze darting around the cavern. Had I moved? The entrance to the shaft seemed further away than it had been moments ago. The path subtly altered, as if the very space had stretched and buckled around me. A loose rock, one I had kicked aside on my descent, now lay directly in my path, several meters from where I remembered it. I pulled out my data pad, my fingers trembling as I attempted to log the incident, to anchor myself in objective reality. I typed furiously, describing the sudden shift, the impossible sensory input. But the coordinates on the datapad flickered, displaying numbers that made no sense, shifting between decimal points, then dissolving into a string of meaningless symbols. My own entries, the observations I had meticulously logged just hours ago, now appeared as jumbled letters, a chaotic mess of corrupted data. The structure pulsed, its faint light seeming to mock my futile attempts at documentation. And I was witnessing it, meticulously, as my own sanity slipped through my grasp like sand. I moved through the Spartan corridors, the soles of my boots adhering with a soft hiss to the grated floor. The processing units whirred, lights blinked, and the air scrubbers sighed, all testament to human ingenuity against an alien cosmos. Yet a new kind of silence had begun to seep into the gaps between these mechanical assurances. My workstation, usually a bastion of ordered data and botanical samples, now seemed to vibrate with an unseen tension. The geological scans I'd run through the structure's bedrock, meant to map its subterranean expanse, now displayed anomalies that defied logic. Lines intersected where they shouldn't, angles shifted with each refresh, and the very concept of depth became a fluid, mocking suggestion. I leaned closer to the holographic display, my fingers tracing a particularly egregious distortion. A segment of the structure that appeared to fold inward upon itself, yet simultaneously extend outward into infinite regression. It was a visual paradox, a wound in the fabric of my understanding. Then the first ripple. Not a sound, not a visual flicker, but a thought, not my own, blooming in the center of my skull. It was vast, formless, a sense of immense duration and an utter lack of concern for the ephemeral. It spoke of cycles too grand for human comprehension, of the slow, grinding turning of cosmic gears that had no beginning and no end. I closed my eyes, pressing the heels of my hands against my temples, trying to push the invasive presence back into the unknown. It receded, leaving behind an echo, a faint, lingering taste of something profoundly ancient and impossibly indifferent. This was no hallucination born of sleep deprivation. It was a foreign imprint, clear and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. The structure wasn't just there, it was touching me. My hand trembled as I reached for a datapad, but before my fingers could close around it, the utility panels around me seemed to waver. The steady glow softened, blurred, and then, with a sickening lurch that twisted my stomach, the metallic walls of my station dissolved. I was no longer in the outpost. The recycled air was gone, replaced by the damp, earthy scent of ancient moss and the faint, briny tang of distant sea. My feet were no longer on graded floor, but on uneven cobblestones, slick with perpetual moisture. A thick, gray shroud hung low, obscuring the sky, pressing down on the world with a palpable weight. A bell tolled, a deep, mournful sound that reverberated through the mist, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. I saw no source for the sound, only the spectral outlines of the gabled roofs disappearing into the impenetrable haze. The air was still, heavy, yet I felt a subtle movement, a presence just beyond the edge of my sight, a silent witness in the enveloping vapor. It was as if the very fog itself was an extension of the pervasive sentience, observing, encompassing. This wasn't a memory, not a dream. It was real in a way that defied all logic, all physics. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the outpost back, willing the solid, familiar, if lonely reality to reassert itself. Then, through the pervasive mist, a shape began to coalesce. And from it, a horrifying understanding washed over me, not in words, but in a profound, invasive knowing. It knew me. It knew my fears, my hopes, my deepest, most buried memories. It saw the fleeting images of my childhood, the face of a lost colleague, the distant, shimmering vision of Earth. It sifted through the intricate tapestry of my identity, not with malice, but with the dispassionate curiosity of a scholar dissecting a specimen. My entire existence, my very essence, was laid bare, exposed to an intelligence so ancient, so utterly other, that my concept of self began to fray at the edges. It was a consciousness, vast and patient, and its mere existence was reshaping my world. I was not exploring it. It was exploring me. The foggy village was a fleeting glimpse into a reality it could project, a memory it could pluck from the ether, or perhaps a space where its influence was so potent, it simply was. I was an open book, and the terrifying truth was, the reader didn't even need to turn the pages. It simply knew. My hands were still outstretched towards the datapad, my knuckles white. The holographic display of the impossible geometry pulsed with an almost imperceptible light, as if in silent acknowledgement. I was back, but not whole. A part of me remained in that impossibly real village, and a part of that vast, indifferent intelligence now resided within me. An uninvited guest, a silent observer in the most intimate chambers of my mind. I rose from the narrow cot, the taste of metallic dust clinging to my tongue, and stared at the door. A low, insistent thrumming resonated not in my ears, but behind my eyes. The corridor, when I stepped into it, was too long, or perhaps too short. The perspective stretched and compressed with each breath, a visual accordion played by an unseen, indifferent hand. I pressed a hand to the cool, unyielding wall, seeking purchase, an anchor. My fingers traced lines that felt alien, not the smooth, prefabricated panels I knew, but rough-hewn stone, damp with an unseen moisture. A vista, not of the exoplanet's desolate ochre plains, but of a winding, cobbled path disappearing into a thick, swirling mist. Structures of dark, timbered wood, their windows like vacant eyes, huddled together in the gloom. A single, distant bell tolled, its sound muffled, ancient. A foggy village. I knew this place. Or did I? The memory was a shard of ice in my mind, sharp and clear, yet utterly out of place. I had never been to such a place. This outpost, this rock, was my entire world for cycles. I stumbled back, my hand flying to the small, laminated photo tucked into a recess beside my console. It was a picture I had carried since before this mission, a grounding image. Me, younger, with my sibling, laughing beside a shimmering lake on a sun-drenched afternoon. I needed to see it, to feel its truth. But as my gaze fell upon the glossy surface, the details began to shift. The lake was still there, but now it was a turbulent sea, its waves crashing against jagged cliffs. The sun was gone, replaced by a gray, weeping sky. And the face of my sibling, once so clear, so beloved, was a stranger's, a different set of eyes, a different curve of mouth. Was it even a sibling? A friend? A fleeting acquaintance? The memory of that day, once vibrant, dissolved into a chaotic swirl of conflicting details. I remembered a picnic, then a solemn funeral, then a silent departure. I had to know. My personal logs, they would hold the truth. I moved to my console, fingers fumbling with the interface. The screen flickered, displaying not my meticulously cataloged xenobotanical observations, but lines of indecipherable glyphs, coiling and uncoiling like living things. The system Word then presented me with a dossier. My name, Cole, was emblazoned at the top, but below it, the The details were a monstrous tapestry of contradictions. I was born on a bustling orbital station, then a quiet agricultural colony, then in the depths of an underground research facility. My parents were scientists, then laborers, then unknown. My specialization was xenobotany, then astrogation, then deep core mining. Each entry was dated, cross-referenced, seemingly irrefutable, and each entry screamed a lie to the one before it. Who was Cole? Was this name even mine? Had I ever truly existed before this moment, or was I merely a construct, a fleeting thought within the unthinking geometry below? The airlock to the exterior, usually a sturdy, reassuring bulk of metal, now appeared impossibly distant at the end of a corridor that bent inward on itself, defying all laws of perspective. I tried to walk towards it, but the floor tilted, sending me stumbling. The gravity, usually a steady artificial pull, wavered, making me feel lightheaded, then impossibly heavy. The fluorescent lights flickered in sequences that spelled no pattern, no code, only a chaotic, rhythmic dance. I saw a reflection in a polished panel, not my own face, but a blurred, shifting visage, like water disturbed by a stone. For a terrifying moment, the features were not human, but something ancient, something that had never known form or face, merely existed. But the certainty was gone. The very sensation of touch felt borrowed, a memory of a sensation rather than the sensation itself. My past, a river I had once known intimately, now fractured into 1,000 splintered streams, each claiming to be the true source. And I, Cole, whoever or whatever that was utterly lost within it. I rose from the narrow cot, but the floor beneath my feet was no longer cold alloy. It was damp, uneven stone, slick with a perpetual moisture. The air, instead of recycled and filtered, was thick with the scent of wet earth and something ancient, like forgotten wood smoke. I blinked, the utility panels replaced by rough-hewn timbers, shrouded in a pervasive gray mist. This was the foggy village. The world had fractured. The outpost, the console, the distant, impossible structure. All had bled into this. A place of crumbling stone cottages and gnarled, skeletal trees. I pressed my palms against my temples. The familiar ache, a dull comfort against the unfamiliarity of everything else. This was not real, my mind screamed. But my senses betrayed me. The dampness seeping into my boots, the acrid scent of decay, a sharp sting in my nostrils. I was here. A desperate resolve hardened within me. If this was its domain, then I would fight it on its own ground. I had to sever the connection somehow. This was it, I thought, a conduit. I scoured the square, my boots scraping on the cobblestones. I hoisted it, the effort straining my muscles, and dragged it towards the well. The weight felt right, real. I would seal it. I would block the source, cut off the insidious tendrils that were weaving themselves through my perception. With a grunt, I lifted the stone, my back protesting, and heaved it towards the well's opening. It fell, not with a satisfying thud, but with a strange, dull click. The stone was gone. Not at the bottom, not resting on the edge, but simply absent. The thrum from the well's maw intensified slightly, a mocking pulse. I tried another, smaller stone, then a broken shard of pottery. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing in, its tendrils reaching, not obscuring, but revealing an emptiness where the stone should have been. Frustration clawed at my throat. My eyes scanned the village, finally landing on a decrepit bell tower, its wooden frame warped and leaning precariously. I stumbled towards it, my legs heavy, the cobblestones blurring beneath my gaze. The path twisted, stretching out impossibly before me, then shortening with each frantic step, as if the village itself was playing a cruel game. I reached the tower, its wood splintered and rotten. The rope, thick with mildew, hung just within reach. I seized it, the rough fibers biting into my palm. With a roar of defiance, I pulled. The bell groaned, a rusty protest, then swung. A sound ripped through the fog, not the clear, resonant peal I had hoped for, but a discordant clang, warped and stretched like a dying animal's shriek. It echoed, not fading but multiplying, each echo subtly different, twisting the original sound into something grotesque, until the air vibrated with a chorus of distorted, overlapping chimes that were somehow inside my head. My hands flew to my ears, but the sound was not external. This wasn't working. Every attempt to sever was an invitation to deepen. I needed to cut the link physically. My hand trembled, but my resolve was grim. I would not be consumed. With a guttural cry, I brought the jagged edge towards my forearm, intending to score a deep, definitive line, a mark of severance. But my hand, though moving with grim purpose, faltered. The slate met my skin, not with a tearing pain, but with a strange, numbing pressure. I looked down. The edge had merely pressed a faint red indentation into my flesh, a shallow line that seemed to shimmer, then fade, leaving no lasting mark. The skin beneath was smooth, unblemished. I tried again, pressing harder, but the slate felt soft, almost pliable against my skin, its sharp edge dissolving into a dull, harmless curve. My arm remained whole, untouched. It wasn't just that my attempts were failing. It was that they were being redirected. My will, my actions, my very desperation to escape were not being fought. They were being absorbed, rendered impotent, bent to an inscrutable purpose. The entity wasn't a malicious force. It was something far worse. It was an indifferent presence that simply was. And my struggle, my pain, my futile defiance were merely ripples in its vast, incomprehensible existence. The foggy village, the silent houses, the ceaseless thrum. All of it seemed to swell, to press in, not with threat, but with a profound, terrifying acceptance. The jagged slate hovered, a cold promise against the tender skin of my forearm. My breath hitched, a raw, ragged sound tearing from my throat. The swirling madness in my mind, the impossible angles and the whispering void, seemed to coalesce into a single deafening roar, urging me to the precipice. I wanted to cut, to feel the sharp, undeniable pain, to prove I was still real, still tethered to this failing flesh. But then, a ripple. The slate clattered from my numb fingers, landing with a dull thud. My vision, once a kaleidoscopic nightmare of non-Euclidean geometry, softened, blurring at the edges. It coiled around my ankles, kissed my face with an icy breath, and swallowed the horizon whole. I stood on a cobbled path, ancient and uneven beneath my boots, leading into a truly unsettling vista. A foggy village. The wood was warped, groaning under the weight of centuries and the perpetual damp. No light pierced the gloom, no fire flickered in the hearths, no lamp glowed in a window. I moved, tentatively at first, then with a growing, desperate purpose. My skin crawled with an awareness of being utterly alone, yet utterly watched. The architecture of the village was unsettlingly familiar, yet wrong. The angles of the rooflines, the placement of the windows, the very slant of the walls. They were almost correct, but subtly, horrifyingly off. A door, half-rotted, hung askew on rusted hinges, its aperture revealing only deeper, impenetrable gloom. Dust motes, caught in the slivers of gray light that managed to penetrate the fog-choked windows, danced in chaotic patterns. And then, I saw it. Not in the dust, nor in the gloom, but in the way the light fractured. A beam, thin and anemic, sliced through a broken pane, striking the far wall. For a fraction of a second, the light did not merely scatter, it bent. It curved sharply, forming an impossible arc, before resolving into a singular, unwavering point. My breath hitched. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, convinced it was another trick of my tormented mind. But when I looked again, the phenomenon repeated. A second later, a third. Each time, the light would arc, impossibly, then snap back to a single focused point. And the arc itself, though fleeting, seemed to trace the same precise non-Euclidean curve. My heart, which had been a frantic drum against my ribs, now surged with a different kind of intensity. This wasn't random. This wasn't the chaotic, unmaking madness I'd grown to expect. This was a signature, a repetition, a pattern within the impossible. My mind, desperate for any anchor in the sea of unreason, latched onto it with ferocious hunger. I moved closer to the wall, my fingers tracing the phantom path of the light. There were no carvings, no markings. The pattern was purely optical, a trick of perception, or perhaps a deliberate broadcast. My thoughts raced, a whirlwind of frantic hypothesis and burgeoning hope. Could this be it? Could this be a form of communication? A language perhaps alien and terrifying, but a language nonetheless? If the entity could manifest such precise, repeatable distortions, it implied a degree of control, even a form of intention. And if there was intention, there was a mechanism. And if there was a mechanism, there could be a weakness. The idea bloomed in my chest, a fragile, desperate flower in the desolate landscape of my despair. All this time, I had perceived the influence as a mindless, crushing force. But what if it wasn't? What if it was merely different? Incomprehensible, yes, but not entirely without structure. The thought was intoxicating, a potent draft of sanity in the encroaching madness. If I could understand this pattern, if I could somehow mirror it or respond to it, perhaps I could establish a bridge. Not to fight, perhaps, but to negotiate. To make it see me, acknowledge me, as something more than a fleeting anomaly in its vast, indifferent existence. My gaze swept around the desolate room, then out towards the foggy village. I would follow this thread. I would learn its language, its impossible grammar. I would find a way to interact with it, to make it understand my refusal to be unmade. My mind, sharp and focused despite the gnawing fear, began to formulate a plan. It would be dangerous, perhaps even suicidal, but the alternative was a slow, agonizing dissolution into nothingness. I would not become a forgotten whisper in the void. I would speak back. This was not surrender. This was a desperate key. A brutal, direct path to the truth I had glimpsed in the shifting geometry. The only way to peel back the final, obscuring veil. I stood not in the familiar, cramped confines of my research station, but on a cobbled path, the air thick and heavy, tasting of decay and forgotten time. A pale, milky light, devoid of any discernible source, struggled to penetrate the suffocating embrace of the mist. I was in a village, or what remained of one, swallowed by an eternal twilight. This was the foggy village. The structures around me were hunched and indistinct, their outlines blurred by the omnipresent fog. My mind, already a tattered sail in a hurricane, recognized this place not as a physical destination, but as a deeper layer of the structure's influence, a landscape woven from its incomprehensible logic. It was a projection, a vision, a reality imposed. And I had sought it. My steps echoed softly, swallowed almost immediately by the dense air. I moved with a strange, unnerving purpose, drawn deeper into the village's heart. There was no fear now, only a terrifying clarity, a stark, unblinking focus. I had come for this, for the final, unvarnished truth, even if it meant my utter dissolution. The fog pulsed, not with wind, but with an internal rhythm, a slow, vast exhalation that seemed to reshape the very air around me. The silence was not empty. It was pregnant with an unimaginable presence, a quiet so profound it vibrated against my bones. I passed a small, derelict fountain, its stone basin cracked and dry, choked with what might have been centuries of moss. As I stepped beneath it, the light, such as it was, dimmed further, and the fog grew denser, a living, breathing wall. Here, the air itself seemed to ripple, the very fabric of space beginning to fold. Then, it was there. Not a shape, not a form, but an absence that was more profound than any presence. The fog in the central square, if it could be called that, was not merely thick. It was a vast, swirling vortex of nothingness. Yet paradoxically, it held an impossible density. Lines of sight curved into themselves, perspectives inverted, and the very notion of up or down became a cruel cosmic joke. This was the entity. Not a being with eyes to see or a mind to comprehend, but an existence so utterly alien that my human perception struggled to even register its boundaries. It was the architect of this warped reality, not out of malice, but out of its mere unthinking being. And in that gesture it responded, not with a roar, but with a revelation. My mind was flooded, not with images, but with pure, unfiltered information. I saw the scale of it, vast beyond stars, ancient beyond time, its existence a casual, indifferent unraveling of all I knew. It was not hostile, it was simply there. My world, my outpost, my very consciousness were less than motes of dust to it, not even registering as an inconvenience. Its actions were not choices, but the inevitable byproducts of its incomprehensible nature, like a mountain eroding a pebble without ever noticing its existence. The indifference was the true horror. It wasn't trying to destroy me, it was simply existing, and its existence was the very antithesis of my reality. My memories, my identity, my sense of self, they were all dissolving, not torn apart violently, but gently, carelessly, unspun by the sheer, unthinking vastness of this entity. I was a fleeting thought in a mind that had no thoughts, a ripple on a surface that knew no disturbance. The foggy village began to fold in on itself, the edges of my vision fraying, the very ground beneath me becoming a non-Euclidean dream. I had sought the truth, and the truth had found me, shattering me into a million unremembered pieces. And then, it did not. Or rather, the precipice was not a cliff edge, but a dissolution, a gentle blurring of boundaries. The slate, when pressed, did not part flesh but rearranged it, not as a wound, but as a silent, internal reordering. The roar in my mind transformed into a hum, a low thrumming that resonated through bone and spirit alike. The bulkhead, a familiar gray, shimmered, not with heat haze, but with an internal luminescence, a soft, gray-white light that pulsed with the rhythm of the hum. And then, the light solidified, not into metal, but into stone, rough-hewn and damp. I stood, or rather, I existed, on cobblestones slick with perpetual moisture. The air, once recycled, now carried the heavy scent of peat and damp earth, the faint, cloying sweetness of decaying leaves. A profound, impenetrable mist swallowed the horizons, turning the world into a series of immediate, isolated moments. This was the foggy village. Not a projection, not an illusion, but a reality layered over the outpost. Or perhaps, the outpost was this. The distinction no longer held meaning. My mind, once a cage of logic, now perceived the simultaneous truth of both, a terrifying symphony of impossible coexistence. My hands, I lifted them. They were still my hands, the lines of my palms familiar, yet the skin felt thinner, more translucent, as if the light within the stone walls of this village bled through them. My fingers, when I flexed them, seemed to trace patterns in the air that were not there, or perhaps were only visible to me. The outpost, as I had known it, was gone. Or, more accurately, it was everywhere. The gentle slope of a thatched roof in the village was, to my newly attuned perception, also the curve of a pressure hull. The distant, mournful cry of a seabird, unheard on this exoplanet, was simultaneously the dying thrum of a failing life support system. Every object, every sound, held a multitude of forms, a chorus of simultaneous realities. This was the entity's influence, not a destruction, but an infinite expansion, a monument to geometries that defied definition. The very air was thick with impossible angles, shimmering just beyond the threshold of ordinary sight. I walked. My stride was unburdened, my steps silent on the wet stone. I passed what might have been a small cottage, its single window glowing with a weak, flickering light. My eyes, once human instruments of perception, now functioned as conduits for 1,000 overlapping realities. A figure emerged from the swirling mist ahead, a hunched form, indistinct. My internal alarm bells, once shrill, now merely chimed with a low, resonant tone. It moved slowly, its head bowed, a bundle clutched in its arms. My mind, however, did not process it as a simple villager. I saw the faint outlines of a pressure suit beneath the homespun cloak, the glint of a toolkit merging with the rustic woven basket. It was a colleague, or the ghost of one, perpetually on some doomed mission. "Are you?" It sounded less like a question, more like a statement of impossible fact. The figure did not respond, did not even seem to acknowledge my presence. It continued its slow, deliberate shuffle, its form shifting, wavering like smoke. The bundle in its arms, initially a basket of goods, then a damaged piece of equipment, now resolved into a cluster of shimmering, impossible flora, radiating faint internal light. The very plants I had come here to study. Now transformed, pulsing with the same non-Euclidean energy that permeated my own being. This was not merely a hallucination. It was a projection of the entity, a manifestation of its indifferent presence, playing out a fragment of a truth within the woven fabric of this new reality. The outpost, my mission, my colleagues. They were all here, subsumed, twisted into new forms, eternally replaying their roles within this impossible tapestry. And I, Cole, was no longer merely an observer. My determination was no longer to escape, but to comprehend, to navigate this terrifying landscape of infinite possibility. My identity, once a singular anchor, was now a confluence of echoes, a living archive of every path not taken, every perception not dismissed. The jagged slate, forgotten in my hand, was no longer a tool for self-harm, but a fragment of the foundational geometry itself. A key. This was the reveal, the discovery. The entity was not merely influencing reality. It was reality, or at least a foundational truth upon which all other realities were built. And I, Cole, had been remade to perceive it. The tension was not in what would happen to me, but in what I would do with this terrible, all-encompassing sight. I was not broken. I was repurposed. The human shell remained, but the core had been reforged in the fires of cosmic indifference, leaving something new, something determined, something profoundly other. The foggy village stretched before me, an invitation to a journey beyond the human. It pierced the internal din, a needle point of sound that seemed to hum not in my ears, but in the very bone of my skull. I dropped the slate. It clattered against the metallic floor with a sound too solid, too ordinary for this place. My eyes, wide and bloodshot, darted around the cavernous chamber, the air thick with the metallic tang of fear and the acrid scent of ozone. The whining persisted, a ghost in the static of my unraveling mind, then solidified into a rhythmic pulse. It vibrated through the floor plates, up my legs, a strange, insistent tremor that felt both alien and terribly familiar. A distant thrum. Not the deep, resonant hum of the structure, but something sharper, higher, like a forgotten memory trying to break through a thick pane of glass. My gaze snagged on the primary console, its screens a riot of impossible colors and shifting geometries. Yet, amidst the chaos, a single panel pulsed with a faint, steady light, an indicator I hadn't seen active in what felt like eons. It was a signal, a thread of reason woven into the tapestry of my derangement. My legs, heavy as lead, carried me forward. Each step was a defiance against the floor that seemed to undulate beneath me, against the walls that breathed and shifted, against the very air that tasted of iron and distant thunder. The console, when I finally reached it, felt both solid and illusory beneath my fingertips. The pulsing light intensified, and a faint, distorted voice crackled from a speaker I'd long forgotten existed. "Outpost, Echo Gamma 7, do you copy?" The words were broken, fragmented, like shards of ice in a storm. They were laced with an impossible echo, as if spoken simultaneously across vast chasms of space and time. My own voice, when it emerged, was a rasp, a dry leaf caught in a gale. I hear you." The console screen, for a fleeting moment, resolved into a recognizable interface. A small, pixelated icon of a vessel hovered, surrounded by data streams that flickered in and out of legibility. Then the screen warped, stretching and bending, the vessel elongating into a skeletal, impossible form, its edges fraying into raw light. Distortion. Severe. Please. Confirm. Integrity. The voice struggled, a desperate cry against the encroaching chaos, a cruel, cosmic jest. As I spoke, the walls of the chamber seemed to dissolve, replaced by a swirling gray mist. The console, once a beacon of order, melted into a gnarled, moss-covered stone. I stood, not in the heart of the outpost, but in the midst of a foggy village. Ancient, crooked buildings, their timber frames groaning under the weight of unseen ages, emerged and receded from the swirling vapor. The air was heavy with the scent of damp soil and wood smoke, a phantom memory of a world I no longer inhabited. Detecting. Anomalous. Energy. Patterns. Non-Euclidean. Geometry. Impossible. The foggy village was a manifestation of my mind, a projection of the structure's influence, yet the voice from beyond was describing it, or at least its underlying impossible reality. It was seeing through my eyes, or perhaps seeing the fundamental wrongness that had become my truth. I looked around, truly seeing the foggy village now. The lowing of an unseen beast echoed from the fog, a sound that twisted into a wordless lament. I wanted to warn them, the distant voices, to tell them to turn back, to flee this place that ate at the fabric of existence. But how could I describe a horror that defied all known physics, all sensory input? No. Life signs. Detected. Only resonance. Signature. Unknown. The voice was fading, growing increasingly desperate, tinged with a raw edge of confusion, recommending immediate withdrawal of probe. A faint, distorted image flickered on the moss-covered stone that was once the console. It was a blurred, ghost-like representation of what I assumed was the probe, a tiny, intricate thing of light and metal. But even as I watched, its form began to ripple, its edges dissolving, its structure seeming to invert upon itself. It was trying to process the foggy village, the impossible angles of the unseen architecture, and it was failing. Its internal logic was shattering against the sheer incomprehensibility of this place. Unstable. Environment. Probe. Integrity. Coherent. Data. Received. System. Overload. The light on the stone pulsed erratically, then winked out. The ghostly image of the probe flickered once more, then vanished. leaving only the swirling mist and the silent ancient buildings of the foggy village. The communication had ceased. They had encountered the horror, seen its impossible reflection, and their instruments, their minds, had recoiled. They had seen enough to know something was terribly wrong, but not enough to comprehend what. They would report an anomaly, a failed mission, a dead outpost. They would never understand that the outpost was not dead, but unmade. The brief, fragile connection to a sane reality had snapped, leaving me adrift, deeper than ever in the shifting currents of this impossible world. I had tried to reach them, or perhaps they had tried to reach me. And in the chasm between our realities, only incomprehension had been exchanged. The true horror, the one that ate at the edges of the universe, remained unseen, unknown, and utterly indifferent. The light on the stone pulsed erratically, then winked out. My breath caught, or perhaps it simply ceased to register, for the air itself felt thin, stretched taut across an impossible void. Communication had ceased. They had encountered the horror, seen its impossible geometry, and now I was utterly alone in its wake. The silence that settled then was not the comfortable hush of a world asleep, nor the stark emptiness of a vacuum. There was no escape, only observation, only understanding. I turned slowly, my boots sinking slightly into the perpetually damp earth of the foggy village. The ancient structures, once merely unsettling, now pulsed with an inner, noiseless light, not of photons, but of presence. The mist, always a companion here, began to writhe with a new, purposeful motion. It was no longer a random atmospheric phenomenon, but a living, breathing extension of the architecture, swirling into forms that defied logic, yet held an undeniable, terrifying beauty. My gaze drifted upwards, past the shifting mist, towards the bruised, alien sky. Where the probe's ghostly image had been, there was now a faint, shimmering distortion, a ripple in the canvas of my perception. It wasn't a physical object, but a memory, a ghost of a ghost, stretched and warped by an invisible hand. The stars, usually a distant, comforting pinprick of light, began to rearrange themselves. Constellations reformed into impossible geometries, their points of light no longer discrete entities, but connected by invisible lines that bent and curved in dimensions I could not grasp. It was as if the entity, having touched the probe, had now begun to weave its influence into the very starlight, sending tendrils of its impossible logic outward. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor vibrated through the ground beneath my feet. It wasn't geological. It was something deeper, a resonance within the bones of the world itself. I reached out a hand, not to touch anything, but to feel the air, to confirm its newfound density. My fingers, once so familiar, felt oddly distant, their nerve endings registering not tactile sensation, but a strange metallic tang on the unseen air. Then, a new perception. A signal. Each color was a data point, not of information, but of pure, unadulterated being. They spoke of the unmaking of worlds, of the quiet expansion of an indifference so vast it dwarfed even the concept of space. I realized then that the probe hadn't just encountered the horror. It had become an unwitting conduit. The stars above, the distant shimmering distortion, the impossible colors bleeding into my vision. They were all symptoms. My own body felt less like solid flesh, and more like a collection of vibrating particles, tenuously held together. I was dissolving, yes, but also integrating. My consciousness felt less anchored, expanding, stretching, becoming less me, and more an extension of the impossible landscape around me. I was becoming a lens, a new guardian, perhaps, not of a place, but of a process. Humanity, with its hopes and fears, its grand narratives and desperate struggles, was utterly, magnificently insignificant. The entity did not hate, did not desire, did not even acknowledge. It simply was, and in its being, it unmade.